Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I am here with a watercolor card tutorial. I'm going to show you how to watercolor a galaxy. There are a lot of great tutorials out there for making different galaxy cards using watercolor, distress ink, a whole bunch of different mediums, but I wanted to do it with just some simple watercolors. Because I feel like when you buy a watercolor set, you get lots of colors, whereas with distress inks, you might not have all the colors, and this might be just a little bit more of an accessible tutorial. Also, it's just really fun to color color galaxies because it's really hard to be wrong when you color them. And mine is, I'm going to try to create the effect of like perhaps a bit of a sunrise over some mountains, but focus on the stars and the nighttime sky at the same time. So I hope you like that. But basically, to get started, I wet my entire piece of cardstock. I am using the Canson 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, and my brush happens to be from Grumbacher. The reason that I chose the particular brush that I'm using is because it is a round brush. It's a little bit bigger. I did want something too small because I wanted to not fuss over the details essentially, and it's a pretty thick brush, so you know, it gives me that that possibility. However, really you can do this tutorial with any brush. I do think a flat brush might be a little bit trickier, a little bit harder to lay down these puddles of color. I am starting by layering down some of the bright colors, and then I will be covering them with some of the darker colors. I laid down a strip of yellow and red to sort of start that sunrise, and then I want it to sort of transition into the black as the sky would do as the sun comes up. And so I went into like a purple and a blue. This is probably not super realistic, but that was fine by me. It still creates that effect. If someone looks at it, they're going to think sunrise, even if it's not 100% accurate. Once I had laid down some initial color, and like I said, I started with my paper wet so that the colors would be really soft and they would blend together. I am going to heat it with a heat gun to start drying it off. This is because I want to layer the black over the other colors, but with the amount of water that is on my paper right now, I am not getting a dark enough black color. So I need things to dry off a little bit and add that black. I thought at first I would be able to get a dark enough black, and that's why I started laying it down, but found out it wasn't working, so I tapped off some of the water and started to dry it so that I could layer the color on more. I generally find that I have to be a little bit more patient with watercolor than I naturally feel inclined to. I kind of like to make things quick, and sometimes you can really get a payoff with watercolor if you give everything a little bit more time and you fuss with it a little bit more, because it is such a forgiving medium. You can go back and take away color and add color and all of that. So if you take your time with it, you can manipulate it in a way that really works for you. So I am again starting to add that black towards the edges. I really want everything to look soft and blended. So once I laid down the black color, I spritzed some water on top of it so that way I could add a lot of water without creating like pools of water, but like sort of an overall mist. And the force of the spray starts to move the color around. And so I think that's always something interesting to experiment with watercolor. Like basically you could get a straw and blow on the watercolor and move the ink around in that way, and the spray bottle creates something a little bit similar. So I did switch to a smaller brush as I tried to add in some details because I wanted it to look less like stripes across the sky and the colors to be mixed in a little bit more together, and I felt that switching to the smaller brush helped with that area where the blue and the purple are meeting. But again, not so much fussing with the red and yellow area because I do think that that looks pretty good for that sort of sunrise effect. I will just add in a little bit of red dots and yellow dots on top so that it's not a solid stripe of red and it has some interest. And when I finish up with the watercoloring, it's going to look kind of iffy. It's not really going to have that effect yet, but I'm going to layer on some other products that are going to lend to the sky effect. but generally just trying to make sure that everything is soft and there are some blends in between. And I'm using two different kinds of spray bottles. I have a traditional spray bottle which gives like a very concentrated spray, and then I have a mist bottle which spreads the water out, and it's a lot lighter and doesn't move the paint around as much. And so I use that there at the end to soften everything. But also having a paper towel on hand to control the water is pretty helpful, or a cloth or something like that. Once I had filled the sky, I was ready to paint in the mountains. And I do not necessarily consider myself an artist. I am a paper crafter. But you know, I created this whole background by myself because it's just simple shapes. You're basically just trying to paint two triangles down here. And I do want you to be able to see that they're two different mountains, so I'm going to make sure one is darker than the other. But, you know, nature is imperfect, and so painting nature can be one of those things, like a good gateway into it. You know, you don't have to worry about the details so much. Landscapes are a good place to start when you're just playing around with watercolor or just learning watercolor. And again, I want these to be a pretty dark black, so what I'm finding is that I have to layer the colors on and wait for one layer to dry before I can add another. With watercolor, the more water you add, the lighter the color, so keep that in mind if you're looking for a darker black. Getting less water on your brush but a good amount of paint certainly helps. And again, watercolor, very forgiving. If you make one mountain too dark, you can always come back and pull some color off or add some color, especially when you use quality paper. That's my biggest argument for investing a little bit more of a good quality paper. It doesn't cost that much more, but can give you a lot more play time with your watercolors before the paper starts to pill. Anything super cheap, you're not going to get that as much. And I'm basically looking to create a shadow look rather than painting the mountains in detail. I want it to look more just like a silhouette of a mountain. Once I had my mountains painted, I was ready to add some details to the night sky, basically some stars. And one of the ways that I'm going to add stars is to take a little bit of gesso. You could also use white paint. And I'm going to mix it with water because I want it to be thinner. I want to be able to spray it. And so I'm going to take a paintbrush and dip it in the wet gesso, and then I am going to use a dragging motion of my finger across the paintbrush to create splattering of stars. What's nice about this whole technique is there's just no way for it to look bad, in a sense. Like, as long as you keep layering it on, your spots aren't too big, they're just going to look like stars. It's an imperfect thing, and there's no certain way that it has to be. So I find that the toothbrush is a good way to get splatters. If you don't have an extra toothbrush, you can of course just use a paintbrush and tap it on your finger and flick some paint onto there, but it doesn't give quite the same look. The paintbrush I find to be a little bit more random. And as you see, I covered up my mountains so that they would not get any stars on them. However, if you do get a little bit of white paint, again, just continue to layer the watercolor on and make it look a little darker again. Also, if you wanted to make your mountains look a little bit more dark, you could possibly go in with an acrylic paint down there, something like that, if that works better for you. But I just wanted to keep it really simple. Like, what could I do with a piece of watercolor paper and my Koi watercolor sketch box, because I'm using the Koi watercolors here. Definitely not the most expensive watercolors out there, but they seem to work great for me. I wanted to add a little bit more star detail. And so I'm using this Perfect Pearls spray from Ranger. There are a lot of different options out there for shimmer sprays. Sukaneko makes some, whatever you like. And if you're a card maker, I'm sure you have plenty of reasons to use sprays. I'm again kind of taking advantage of the fact that the spray will move the watercolor around a little bit, and it's going to react with the watercolor. It's going to reactivate the watercolor since it's wet. And so I spray in the corner. And this time, I only covered my mountains with my hand. wasn't the best choice that I could have made because there is sparkle all over my mountains. And covering it with watercolor paint is only going to reduce that a little bit. You're still going to see the sparkle through it since watercolor is not opaque. Again, you could go in with an acrylic paint and make your mountains darker, or go in with like a marker or something and try to cover it a little bit more, but I was kind of okay with the shimmer on my mountains, and so I let it be. Then I put this all aside to dry, and I was ready to turn this into a card. I think it's fun to play with watercolor and make backgrounds, but I like to make something useful out of it. Not to say that paintings aren't useful, but you can only hang so many in your house. And this is a way to like make a painting and send it off. And if you don't make cards, but you just like to paint, I would suggest buying postcards, like watercolor postcards, because then you could paint a postcard and send it off to a friend. And you need a little less supplies for that because you could kind of just finish it off. I'm going to stamp a sentiment. Again, if you're not a card maker, you could buy stickers and put a sentiment on top, or you could handwrite a sentiment. That would be like the easiest thing to do. Like look up some fonts online and just try to copy the style of the font to add something a little bit different than your handwriting if that's what you prefer. And I am stamping with VersaFine ink. I'm using a Misty tool. You could use a stamp block, of course. The reason that I'm using the Misty tool is because watercolor paper is a little bit uneven and can be hard to stamp on, but I find that VersaFine ink does a pretty good job because it's a stickier ink. And I'm also going to, I thought I was going to maybe clear emboss it, but I wasn't sure. So I just kind of wanted to leave that possibility open. And then I am stamping the rest of the sentiment. This stamp set is, I believe it's called Make-A-Wish, but it's from Create a Smile Stamps, which is a German stamp company that makes a lot of really awesome images. But I wanted to keep it simple. I didn't want to add any extra stamping, just a sentiment to this, and then I could use it for a birthday card. So once I have that sentiment stamped, I am going to trim it up and put it on a card base. If you do need to fix any imperfections, you could always use a black pen. And that is it for my card today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you are interested in more paper crafting tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel. In the video description below, you can find links to the products and to my social media. And thanks for watching. Bye.